Burns. I'm an assistant director here, and I just want to welcome everybody to Reid Memorial Library today for this fantastic event we're having here. I would like to extend a special welcome to our visitors from Pleasant Hill High School, who have made a rather extensive trip down here today to meet with Laurie and hear what she has to say. So welcome, guys. We really appreciate you being here, and I'm really glad you were able to make it. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're a Lewis and Clark student, we do have a sign-in sheet, so we want to make sure that you get credit for the class and all of that. Steve Higgins is being Vanna White in the back right now, so please make sure that you fill that out. And we also have a raffle for a chance to win a few prizes, including a sort of complete set of some of Laurie's books. So if you haven't entered that and you'd like to, you can do that now or later or whatever. And we'll just get this kind of rolling. I am not real good at introductions in general, and this one is a little bit harder for me than normal anyway, because, what do you say about somebody who, as I told the group earlier, that you have really admired for a really long time. And I've read pretty much everything that Laurie Halse has ever written, more than once. And so just the fact that she was able to squeeze into her really tight schedule a visit here means a ton. And at the risk of almost crying, I think I'm just going to say without any further ado, it is an honor and a privilege to welcome Laurie Halse to Lewis and Clark.
How you doing? Good. Yeah, that was lame and pathetic. Good God, you guys. Come on. How you doing?
Good.
Yeah, you can go to sleep when I start talking, but yeah. Thank you so much for coming. You guys came from like 8 hours away, right? You had to travel by dog sled and covered wagon and boats. So thanks. I hope I took you out of the class you didn't study for. Yes, that's my job here. And everybody else who's here as a college student, don't forget to get credit for showing up here. If anybody needs a note, it's like really, really cut them some slack. They've been working hard and they're tired. It's November. So I'm Laurie Halse. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about who I was when I was a kid, because nobody who knew me as a kid thought I'd be alive right now. Why I wrote Speak and how that has changed my life. And then we'll open up for questions, so be thinking about those. And also, please, I'm going to be talking about sexual violence for the next hour. And sexual violence sucks. It's horrible. Sadly, way too many of us are victims of it, male and female. And because I know the statistics really well, I know that there will be victims of sexual violence in this room right now. And so sometimes, depending on where you are, kind of what kind of day it is, how much you've processed it, there's a lot of this stuff being discussed in the news right now. This might be a hard conversation, parts of it to listen to. So if you, for any reason, gotta pee, you're feeling overwhelmed, whatever, if you just need to go out and take a breather or whatever, please do. Radical self-care is a habit that we all need to practice if we're gonna get through this life in any kind of shape to make our own positive contribution. Also, you're kind of grown-ups, so if you're like, I'm boring you, go. Never stick around when someone's boring you. Life's too damn short. All right, here we go. Like I said, that's the book. God dang, it's so strange, because this is, I think, Speak's been out 18 years now. So we're coming up on the 20th year, and I wasn't supposed to be a writer. I hated English class. Anybody who knew me when I was a kid, when they find out, not that I go back to my reunions, but people I went to high school with, when they find out that actually I've turned out to be, for all intents and purposes, a fairly, I got my stuff together. And my books sell millions of copies, and you guys have to read them in school. Sorry about that. Anybody who knew me back then is very confused because they remember who I was, right? I hated school. Apologies to the teachers in the room, but honestly, I was born with 3 qualifications that made it very challenging to be a student, but made it really fun to be me. I was born tall, right? Which meant that I always got to sit in the back row of the classroom, because it wasn't fair for the shorter kids to have to look through this giant blockhead trying to see the board. I was born with a very vivid imagination. I've always been making stuff up. That's how I amuse myself when life is boring, which is most of the time. And I was also born with a very, very short attention span. That's my superpower, right? People who don't understand the power of short attention spans tend to be able to focus on things for long periods of time. And so all of those things combined made school very, very challenging. I had a hard time learning how to read, so got yanked out in elementary school for extra reading support as well as speech therapy because I didn't speak clearly. And after that, it was just like, for me, showing up to school was something I had to do. So, you know, the hope was that someday I might graduate high school, but nobody's expectations were much higher than that. Now, when I was a little kid, life was pretty much fun, you know, just kind of bumbling around. I was a big, strong kid, so I was a swimmer. That was fun. My parents were pretty much doing okay. But then things got complicated, the way they do. You know, in 7th grade, because of this guy. This is my dad. That's not what he looked like when I was in 7th grade. That's what he looked like at the end of World War II. He was a young soldier. He was 18 when he was drafted into the Army. And when they sent him to Germany, it was towards the end of the war. So he was with the troops that were, their responsibility was to help take care of the survivors of concentration camps, specifically Dachau. So my dad was a country boy from northern New York. I was raised in a very rural area just south of the Canadian border. And so Daddy went from being the kind of a sheltered country kid to seeing the worst of humanity on display and having to help these poor families in Dachau. That changed my dad forever. It's what made him a minister, because he had seen what hate could do. And he came away from Germany determined to try to base his life in love. And he thought going into ministry would do that. But like so many veterans of all wars, and a lot of them in World War II, he also came home with a wicked case of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In the greatest generation, that's what we call those veterans, that word hadn't even been invented yet. But what we know about the soldiers like my dad is that they came home, they tried to put all those memories into a box that they never wanted to open up. And sometimes when they were haunted by the things that they'd had to deal with, they all turned to alcohol, which is what my father did. So by the time I got to middle school, my dad really kind of had a breakdown and was an amazing human being who was also a suicidal, alcoholic, scary man. So that complicated my life considerably. For those of you who have parents who are struggling with any kind of substance abuse, my heart is with you, because that's one of the hardest things I know of. So for me, between my family situation and the fact that I really didn't like school at all, this is what high school felt like to me. It was just like, every single day, why do I have to do this? Why do you hate us so much that you send us? It's like the institution of high school for kids like me. It feels like we took everything we knew about the development of adolescence, and then we designed a system designed to break their spirit, right? As much as we possibly can. So this was complicated further by the fact that I was raped when I was 13 years old, a couple of weeks before high school started. For those of you who have read my book, Speak, what happened to Melinda is not what happened to me. If anybody wants to ask me about it later, I'm happy to share how it unfolded. But what I borrowed from my experience to put into the book was my emotional truth. The emotional truth of having a really bad thing happen to you and then struggling to find the courage to speak up about it. Because my dad had a temper, and from the North Country, so he was a hunter. I thought if I told, he would find the boy and he'd shoot him. So I didn't tell anybody for 25 years, which, as it often does after, if you go through any kind of traumatic experience and you don't get the support that you need, it very commonly leads to depression. Untreated depression then leads to other behaviors as you're trying to self-medicate, which cause more problems. And you have this negative, very negative spiral. I think the most recent statistic about rape survivors that I've read is I think the attempted suicide rate is 13%. The one thing that I did, though, that really changed my life in a really positive way is that I left the country when I was 16. If you haven't left the country yet, go get your passport when you leave here, right? Everybody needs to leave the country. It's kind of we have a lot of challenges in the United States, but it's a pretty awesome place. But especially when you're young, if you can get to a different country and live with people who are different from you, learn a new language, learn a new culture, then come back because we need you. We need your intelligence and your integrity. Come home. It gives you some perspective that you really need. So I became a foreign exchange student my senior year. So I missed my entire senior year. Best thing I ever did in my life. This is the woman who I look up to more than any living person on the earth. I wound up being sent to Denmark. I lived on a pig farm in Denmark for a year. You will know how much I hated high school when I tell you the pig farm in Denmark was a big step up, right? All the bacon we could eat. That was awesome. If you ever get a chance to go to Denmark or Scandinavia, please do. They're remarkable people. This was a farming family. They were more sober than my family, really strong marriage, and they just opened up not only their homes, but their hearts. So that gave me a much needed year of respite and healing. When I came back to the United States, I was not going to go to college. I had this conversation with my dad. I said, Daddy, A, we're broke, always, and B, I hate school. And college is school you have to pay for. That just sounds like hell, right? And he said, okay, my dad when he was sober, he was pretty awesome. So he says to me, so where are you going to live? And I said, here. He said, oh, okay. And then he did some calculating on a piece of paper and he showed me my bill. He said, if you're not going to college, this is what it's going to cost you every month to live here. Fox, he's an old, smart fox, my father. So I got it, we were living out in the country, and I was used to farm work. I didn't have a car, so I needed a job that I could ride my bicycle to. So I got a job milking cows. Do you know how hard it is to get a date when you smell like cow manure, right? You know, I'd scrub my fingernails and I'd wash my hair, right? And I'd go to the clubs and dancing, right? And he gets a little close and you see the guy go, oh, it's like, oh, not cool, not cool. So that's why I went to college, was so I could get a date, you know? If you ever need motivation to hold up, you know, to stay in college or whatever, keep working on that degree, go work on a farm for a couple weeks. See what people tell you, what you smell like. What I did then was, except for going to Denmark, this was the second smartest thing I ever did. I enrolled in Onondaga Community College in Syracuse, New York. I am a very proud graduate of community college. I would not be who I am today without it. And because I'd had that year of maturing, and because I was paying for college on my own by getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and milking those blessed cows, shoveling them out, you know, it was before all the technology in the barns. Instead of sitting in the back row at college, I sat in the front row, right? Because I'm cheap. I decided, well, if I have to do this stupid college thing, I might as well get my money's worth. So I showed up to every class, sat in the front row, read all my assignments, actually did the homework, and when I didn't understand anything, I would raise my hand and ask questions. I became that girl, right? That girl who's always sticking her hand and go, Miss, I didn't understand that. Can you please explain it again? And then when the jackasses in the back row would like complain sometimes, you know, you'd hear from the back row, I'd turn around and say, did you write my tuition check? Because I don't remember you writing my tuition check. Miss, can you please explain that again? Right? And an amazing thing happens. If you show up to every class, do your homework, sit in the front row and ask questions, you can't help but get good grades. It's like a miracle. Turns out I'm smart. I didn't know that until I was like 19 years old. I did so well in community college that the very lovely people at Georgetown University threw a giant scholarship at me. And that's where I wound up getting my 4-year degree. Throughout that, though, I never studied writing. I never studied literature. because I hated it when I was in school and they used to make us analyze books, right? Oh, grand irony, right? God looked at me and she said, oh, that looks like that could be an author. Let's mess up her life, right? By making her write books that people will then spend 40 years analyzing. Nice, we've come full circle. So after a while, you know, I survived college, got married, had some kids, was working as a journalist. And when my kids were little, that's when I thought, you know, I like stories, I like books. Little kids are kind of stupid, right? How hard can it be to write picture books? Because Madonna does it. She's not exactly a brain surgeon, you know? Princess Fergie writes picture books. So I had lots of good ideas. Remember, vivid imagination, short attention span, picture books, not many words. So I started to write out all these great book ideas, check them for spelling, and I'd send them to New York. And they came back. They came back with breathtaking speed, but I was not just arrogant. I was arrogant and ignorant, which is a terrible combination. So I continued to write books and send them out and get them rejected for about 3 years. A rejection letter is what they send you when your book sucks. And they're very polite, they're very adult. Oh, darling, thank you so much for your submission. But they're really, the subtext is, man, you can't write your way out of a paper bag. So I actually had to go back and realize that I had been wrong, and that maybe my teachers had been right, and the concept of revision might actually help me. I had been turning in my first drafts. And if there's anything you want to take away from this in terms of writing process, it's this. Nobody gets a first draft published. When you're reading a book, I guarantee you it's been through draft after draft after draft. That's how I became a writer. Right? I decided that telling stories was something that was important to me, important enough that I had to go back and relearn what my teachers had tried so hard. If I had paid attention in high school, I'd be driving a much nicer car. Right? If you need a monetary example, I have a 2007 Honda Fit. It's kind of a piece of junk. So if you want to do successful faster, I eventually made it, but it just took me a long time, a little thick-headed. So I write two kinds of books. These books, contemporary YA novels, young adult novels, that look at the stresses that adolescents and young adults have to deal with in today's world, are probably what I'm best known for. But I have a short attention span. So I also write historical novels. Fever 1793 is often read in middle schools. It's got a lot of dead people in it. A real epidemic that hit Philly in 1793. That book led me to kind of study the American Revolution and try to figure out what is mythology about the American Revolution and what is the reality. The reality is all the white people were talking about freedom when 20% of American families were held in slavery. And the Continental Army was an integrated army. This is the last time our army was integrated until the Korean War. And that by the end of the Revolution at the Battle of Yorktown, Siege and Battle of Yorktown in 1781, about 25% of our forces were men of color. So when I look at the problems, the racial injustice facing America today, I can trace that all the way back to the founding of the United States, when we had really great ideals, that all people are created equal, that we are all entitled to certain inalienable rights, among them, but not limited to them, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what we promised ourselves. We're still working on fulfilling that promise. I think understanding our history is a really good way to start that. The one thing that all these books have in common, though, both the young adult contemporary stuff and the historical novels, is that I'm the lady who likes to make people uncomfortable, right? I talk about the elephant in the room, whether that's about sexual violence, eating disorders, suicide, or racial injustice. I remember so clearly as a teenager, you know when you're a young teen and your eyes are beginning to open up and you're starting to see the hypocrisies of the world, and you're just like, wow, this is total bullshit, right? This is like, you guys are saying this, but you're doing that, and no one's talking about this giant gap. And I was so confused by that as a kid. And I think I've never lost that sense of confusion and that sense of wanting it to be better. So I've turned into a lady that writes books about hard things, that writes books about things that we often struggle to talk about because we don't have the language. Kind of ironic then, again, that the first book is called Speak. I love this picture on the right here. That's actually student artwork. 2 11th graders in Minnesota did that. Seeing the artwork that often comes out of kids studying my work is a super, super, I don't know, it honors me when I see that. It's kind of exciting. So Speak I wasn't going to write these kinds of books, but as my oldest kid got to middle school, I was beginning to reflect on my experience. And for those of you who don't have children here, if you do choose to have children, the day will come when your kid all of a sudden, like overnight, turns into, like, they look like an adult. I swear to God, Stephanie went to bed that night looking like she was 11, and she came down the next morning looking like she was 22. I was like, oh my God, where did those come from? You know, it's just horrifying when it's your first kid and you're like, oh, it just got real, right? Because as a parent, you have your little kid, and then, oh. I wanted to walk behind my daughters with a sign that says she's 12. Don't look at her that way. I'm going to kill you. She's 12, right? So I think that had a lot to do with why I finally, at that age, began to reflect on what I had been through and found the voice to talk about speaking up. This is a very interesting time to be traveling the United States, talking about sexual violence, as we have Me Too and Harvey Weinstein and a senatorial candidate in Alabama, not to mention all kinds of other people. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that the amount of sexual violence that goes on in the United States is a much larger number than even the best statistics reflect. We have a strange culture in the US where this combination of old school Puritanism meets internet porn, right? And I have a son, so I know what's on the internet. It's kind of horrifying. Right? Way too many boys are learning about sexuality through pornography, and I can understand the temptation, but you know, when that's where you're learning what you think healthy human sexuality is, and then you are around in the world where adults don't know how to talk to you about sexuality, then that leads to a lot of problems. But Speak is about a lot more than sexual violence. What I've learned is not only are there way, way more victims, male and female, of sexual violence, but pretty much everybody by the time you get to about 25 has had something awful happen to them. And if you're in a really great situation with the people in your life, then you can turn to them. But too often in adolescence, kids don't feel like they have somebody that they can turn to. So I think the reason that Speak has had a larger impact than anybody expected is that we've all survived something. And one of the biggest lessons and challenges we face in life is finding the courage to speak up about the hard things. And your parents and my parents didn't know how to teach us how to do that. So it's hard for us when you haven't had a model about, you know, how do I speak up about these things? It's hard to figure out where do you start. Briefly, it's interesting because Speak has been censored and banned all over the place, including Liberty, Missouri. That was a fun story. Because parents get freaked out when they find out that kids are reading my book in 9th grade. It's a book that talks about the aftermath of sexual violence. And the truth is that the kids in 9th grade are at in the largest risk pool for becoming victims of sexual violence. When Speak first came out, people said, well, school boards began to reluctantly allow the book to be taught in the last semester of senior year of high school. Because I had a meeting with some school board members, and they said, wow, we know our kids are going out into that big scary world, and so they need to know about this before they go out there. These days, it's now commonly taught in 7th to 8th grade. And it should be, I'd love to see all school districts be able to talk to kids about concepts like consent starting in kindergarten. So many of the victims of sexual assault are 34% of the victims under 18 are under the age of 12. We have this, in our culture, we operate with this myth that sexual offenders are the bad guys in the bushes with a gun. Nothing could be further than the truth. That's the deeply scary part. Most of the people who commit acts of sexual violence, which is a scale, right? On the one hand, you've got harassment, catcalling, whistles, hey baby, right? And then it escalates to the grabbing, it escalates to, you know, frank sexual assaults and roofies and getting somebody, you know, completely blacked out drunk and doing horrible things. So there's this continuum. 3/4 of the people who commit acts of sexual violence are known to the victim. They're friends, right? There's people that they trust. Sometimes it's relatives. Sometimes it's their date. I've spoken to tens of thousands of victims of sexual assault, male and female. I've never spoken to a woman who has committed an act of sexual violence or will admit to it. But I have spoken with some guys. And it is fascinating to listen to how they're processing this. Because so many young men don't get like decent instruction about human sexuality and personal integrity. They don't understand what the rules are. And then as they begin to learn more, they'll say things like, yeah, well, one time I might have gone too far. Or, yeah, I pushed it. Saying things like rape is a really hard, who wants to consider themselves to be a rapist? And often I've had some conversations where the guys will look back, it was a girl that they were in love with. And now that they've learned, oh, I'm supposed to ask somebody, right? They look back and they're like, oh. So that's not a nice thing to have to live with either. So there's so much of this going on. But we are beginning to speak up, right? This whole Me Too campaign is awesome. What's most important, though, is not the headlines. I think what's most important are the conversations that are going to start going across the country after presentations like this or after just reading the newspaper, where friends turn to other friends and say, well, what do you think about this? Or, this happened to me. Or guys are going to ask their friends who are girls, well, wait, what? Right? Because unless somebody has sat you down and explained what the rules are, the problem continues. When Speak came out 18 years ago, you didn't hear language like rape culture. And there's been this tremendously wonderful shift in the law, as well as in the culture, to what's called consent-based sexuality, right? It's not that you have to get somebody to say no or fighting you off. You're going to have sex with somebody, they need to say yes. And it should be an enthusiastic yes. Enthusiastic, ongoing, sober yes. That's just kind of fun, right? When you can get to that yes, you have done your work, my friends. And then everyone's screaming. Oh, this is mostly a white room. What's fun about talking to white people is that you can tell when they start blushing, right? And it's like all these pink cheeks start glowing around the room. Imagine being the guy who wanted to date my 16-year-old daughter. You know, oh, these were brave boys. Brave boys. Because here's the way it works. If you want to have sex with somebody, a nice person, doesn't smell like cow manure, all right, this is going to work, let's roll. So you need to have a conversation with that person first. This conversation needs to happen when you're both sober, and you need to have it with your clothes on, no naked time. Because naked people are such a distraction, right? So you need to have your clothes on, be sober, have a table in between the two of you, talk about it in the library or McDonald's, you know? Because you need to have this conversation in order to make sure that everybody's on board, right? We know exactly what we want to do here. And you have jointly come together to decide how you're going to prevent sexually transmitted diseases, which are gross and can kill you. And also, assuming that you don't want to have babies, how are we going to prevent that? These conversations can't happen, or they shouldn't happen, when you're under the influence. But you'll notice that sometimes when you even think about having these conversations, you start to go, oh God, God, I can't ask him that. Or, I can't, that's just like, this is the weirdest woman in the world. How can I ask this girl this, right? This is why when you go to parties and you see somebody you want to hook up with, you reach for the red cup, right? Bam, down. Because that reduces your anxiety and it makes it a little bit easier, and now you're starting to dance, and all of a sudden clothes are falling off, and you don't have consent. You didn't talk about it. So what I like to point out is that when your stomach is like tying in a knot, when you're thinking about having a conversation like that, that's just your body being super smart and pointing out that if you can't talk about it, then you're not ready to do it. It's all right, we have drugs now. You're going to have sex for the next 80 years, I promise you. Why do you think your grandparents are so damn happy? Right? We have the chemicals now. You've got decades. Yes, there's a reason they moved to Florida. It wasn't because of the weather. They didn't want you guys to be knocking on the door at the wrong time, right? So you need to have the conversation, sober, informed, clothes on, and then you make sure that your partner is really interested in this. John Oliver has done a couple really good sessions talking about sexual violence. I love this boxing. Sex is like boxing, right? If somebody comes up and punches you in the face, that's not boxing, that's a crime. If you agree that you're both going to put on your safety gear and go to the right location at the appointed time and place, and then try to pummel each other, that's boxing, right? Same thing applies to having sex. You should all be aware of what the laws are in the state that you're living, because it varies dramatically from state to state in the United States in terms of what the law requires. But it's kind of nice to see in the United States, starting with the state of California, our judicial system beginning to be much more realistic about these kinds of settings. And there's some great models over in Europe about the fact that actually you can teach people to have these conversations. And that's the best way I know of to reduce incidents of sexual violence. Yeah, so I'm the lady who, I used to be a shy person, by the way. That got thrown out of the window a long time ago. One of the strangest things that's happened in my life is that me, the obnoxious kid who never read a single assigned text in English class, they teach my book in school now. It's just so weird. It's fun. It's fun. It's interesting because I can remember one of the things that I put in Speak on purpose, I borrowed from a horrible thing I said to my 10th grade English teacher, because she was making us read The Scarlet Letter. I loathed that book. And so I was a dumbass who raised her hands and said, "Miss, you keep on talking about this symbolism. How do you know that Hawthorne really meant this to symbolize that," right? And never say that to an English teacher, because it gets them right where they live and then you get in trouble. And now people take my book apart and they look for the symbolism in it, which is just wonderful. I did put some symbols in my books deliberately, but honestly, I'm one of those people who don't think that it matters anything what an author intended something to symbolize. All that matters is what the reader gets out of the experience. This weekend I'll be speaking at the National Council of English Teachers. It's being held in St. Louis this year, and I will be explaining to them again, teachers, please go easy on the symbolism, because we want our kids to keep loving books, because we want our kids to keep reading for fun, because when you keep reading for fun, then your literacy and your brain continues to expand and grow stronger. Another thing, the unexpected thing that happened is that I've become an advocate for the First Amendment against censorship, because people have tried to ban my books and get them taken out of schools and libraries. There's a lot of countries in the world where people can go to jail or be killed because of what they think or what they speak or what they write. This is not one of those countries. In the First Amendment to our Constitution, they made it very clear, our founding fathers, that in this country, you have the right to intellectual freedom. You have the rights to say what you want, to write what you want, to read what you want. The government can't interfere with that. So that's become a part of my life. When they first started to censor my books, my reaction like 15 years ago was, I was like, first of all, I cried because I was a wuss. But then I got really angry. And then I dropped my defenses and I started to engage the people who were trying to censor my books in conversation. so I could understand what their perspective was. And what I usually ran up against were parents who were afraid. Parents who loved their kids every bit as much as I love my children, but they didn't know how to talk about human sexuality. They didn't know how to talk about bullying. They were afraid that if my kids read this book, then they're going to do this thing, and I don't know how to fight that as a parent. And then I point out to them that I've never put anything in a book that the kids aren't going to see in the newspaper in their school library. But we've used literature in Western culture for thousands of years to pass on wisdom to our kids, to the next generation. And the smartest thing any parent can ever do is to read what their kids are reading, watch what their kids are watching, and then open up the doors to communication. So I go around the place and I talk about these things that are hard to talk about, try to open up the doors a little bit, make sure that we can communicate. One of the things that I've learned over the decades is that when you see adults whose lives aren't working, adults who are dealing with chronic depression, who are self-medicating or just have fallen into habits that you know when you see them aren't super healthy. Often something went wrong from the time that person was about 10 to 25. And there, American culture has been steeped in silence and shame for generations. And those adults who don't deal with those hard, painful things are the ones who often, by the time they get to be my age, are struggling. YA novels are read, at least half the YA novels in the United States that are sold to adults who are reading them and reporting that reading about these books are helping them begin to kind of go back and get some healing. Generations have their different approaches to art, which is why we've done a graphic novel version of Speak. That's going to be coming out in February. For those of you who don't know much about graphic novels, I encourage you to dive in because it's a magnificent form of literature that is very, very exciting to be a part of. So that's all the stuff that I had to say. Everybody take a deep breath, wake up, and clap for me because I did a nice job. Now we've got some time for questions, I think, right? Who's bold and brave and has questions? Right there, nice work.
So you talked about how your first approach to writing were children's books. So at that moment when things weren't working out, what was your thought process? Was it like, I know that I'm meant to be a reader and to share this with the world, and if that was your thought process, what helped you to take those no's and to stand in your own truth and to continue to stand in your truth and move forward until things came into fruition?
That is an excellent question. I'm going to try to summarize that in case anybody couldn't hear it and make sure I got it right. What it sounds like you're asking me is, when I went through those years of rejection, how did I find the gumption, right, to hold on to that dream and keep fighting for it, even though clearly it wasn't working. And actually there's another piece of that, and the piece is, even after you've been published, that doesn't guarantee happiness or success or money or anything, because you can get a book published and it turns out that's just the first step. Like I wrote a book that's actually kind of really funny and nobody dies in it. It's called Prom. The reviews for that book started out by saying, oh, her career began so promisingly with Speak, and then it was excoriated me. So even when it looks like, oh, things are working, you get reviews like that and you think I should never have left the farm, because the cows would only just poop on me. These people are actually throwing it in my face, right? I think that you guys are all at the age where the people who love you are probably looking at you saying, follow your dreams, right? But go to college and get a degree and move out of my house as soon as you can, right? And so that's a real mixed message. For anybody who's interested in trying to pursue an artistic life, what I always advise is that unless you want to stay in your parents' basement for an extra 20 years, have plan B. because plan B is what's going to pay your rent and your food. Like maybe once a generation can somebody in whatever artistic field, bam, hit the scene and then be able to support themselves with their earnings. Most of the time we're all just scratching, right? So we have day jobs and keep on trying. I would still be writing for fun if I had never been published. Writing for me is something that helps me make sense of the world. I draw too. I don't know if I'll ever try to get those out in the world, but drawing calms me. It makes my world circle the way it's supposed to. And then I try to get that out in the world to share it, the writing at least. I think that sometimes we overlook stubbornness as a good personal quality. Being incredibly stubborn is helpful in these kinds of situations. But also it has to be this kind of bizarre, self-aware stubbornness, because you have to, if you want to get better, you have to be willing to acknowledge, I'm probably not good enough yet, so how can I become better? And then even after you have some success, if you want to keep on being true to your art, true to whatever gifts are in your spirit, then you always want to be looking for opportunities to learn more, right? If you focus on the process, on the learning and the growing and the production of the art, then the rest will take care of itself. Does that make sense to you? Excellent question. You're welcome. What else? I'll write extra point notes for anybody who asks a question. Yes? Oh, good question. Do I stay connected to the internet when I'm trying to write, or do I disconnect? For the next 5 weeks, when I go home for Thanksgiving, I'll be home for 5 weeks, which is an incredible luxury. And so I probably won't be tweeting too much. If you do see me tweet, it'll be first thing in the morning and then like after dinner. There's an app that I have to use though, because I am weak. I am weak and pathetic. And I used to be like really cranky. I was like, wow, just turn off your Wi-Fi. Well, that's hard. So there's an app that I use, I have a Mac, that's called Freedom, where you can set a timer on when you can access certain sites, and it'll go across all of your devices. So that's what I need. That's sort of like my babysitter. But you know what, your mileage may vary. Creating art is such a personal thing, and your life is, everyone's life is kind of unique, so you've got to find the system that works best for you. I love social media, because it's so much more fun to be able to connect with readers that way. And then you get to meet people that you wouldn't probably have met, so I like that a lot. Can I talk to you briefly about writer's block? Because I've learned a lot about writer's block over the years. And it has a lot to do with neurobiology, which is actually very interesting, the way your brain works. So the writer's block is caused by a couple things. It's caused, number one, because your standards are too high. It's caused, number two, because we procrastinate, because we're human beings. And it's caused, number three, because we're sitting too much as human beings. So let's start with the first two. Your standards are too high. When you guys read a book, or a comic, or a finished piece of art, you're seeing something that has been worked on generally for years. My books will go through 7 or 8 drafts before they're published, and then that's before my copy editor goes in and fixes all my comma mistakes, right? If you saw my first drafts, you would say, this woman's insane, right? Because my first drafts are a hot mess. Like they bear very little resemblance to the final product, because I have to get that hot mess on paper to finish out what I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to write about. So what happens is, by the time you guys get to about 10, 12 years old, you know what good writing looks like. And when we know what good writing looks like, it's up here. But when any human being tries to put a story down on paper, it's a hot mess, right? Because it's just that early draft. So what happens is then we start to get that negative self-talk. You get that voice in your head that says, you suck, right? It's like a Slytherin voice, right? And it's hard not to pay attention to that voice. And then it says, oh, no one's going to read this. Oh my gosh, you are such a poser. You're never going to be an author or an artist or a singer or an actor. You are pathetic. You're going to lose everything. You're going to wind up living under a bridge. And you're going to be one of those cat ladies that lives under a bridge and smells like urine. And then when you die, the cats are going to eat your flesh. Having a vivid imagination can be a scary thing sometimes, right? So when you go through that negative self-talk, and because you're judging your work by a standard that you shouldn't be using, you're judging your work by the final standard. When in an early draft, you should just be patting yourselves on the back because you got something on the paper. You are amazing, right? You are brave and bold and wrote it down. That's what you got to do to get started. When you go into the negative part, though, what happens to the chemicals in your brain is that, because our brains are pretty stupid, you trigger all of the fight or flight chemicals in the amygdala, right? You're getting nervous, your anxiety, your heart goes up, right? Because you're afraid. You're thinking bad things are going to happen because I suck. This is also why procrastination is so deadly. We procrastinate because you can't think of a good idea, or you're afraid that when you start writing it, it's terrible. So when you get to that place of discomfort, Twitter, right? Or I'm going to go gaming, or I'm going to call my friend, or I'm going to watch the Kardashians because my life is worthless, right? Because that feeling of discomfort also triggers. And then the procrastination makes it work. That makes it worse. Because now you have another layer of anxiety. It's the anxiety of, I haven't gotten this done. I haven't gotten this done. So you keep on pushing it off. So the trick is to, instead of using a shame spiral, make it one of, look how awesome you are. Getting up out of your chair is a big part of this. The human body was not designed to sit 18 hours a day. The best thing anybody who wants to do anything artistic can do is to commit to taking one good walk a day, or a run, or a swim, whatever your mobility allows you to do, or what's interesting to you. And then as soon as you have an idea, as soon as you have an assignment, you start working on it that night, instead of waiting until like 6 o'clock the morning that it's due. Because you want to first of all, you want to get in the habit of just throwing your ideas on paper and going, I'm pretty amazing. Everybody else I know is still gaming, right? They haven't even started. And then once you get the awful, horrible first draft on paper, you can always make it better. And when you improve something, it's like, if you start lifting, if you start doing push-ups, after a couple of weeks, it's like, oh, I can do more now. And that feeling of success is so rewarding. You're strengthening your writing muscles the same way that you can strengthen your physical muscles. And now you get in a positive, now you find yourself waking up wanting to write. Speak was mostly written between 4 and 6 in the morning, because I had 2 kids and a day job. And waking up excited to work on my art it's a joy. That's when you know you're doing it right. All right, time for a couple more questions. If there's, yeah, right there. Where did that come from, lady? Yeah. So I wrote a book from a guy's point of view. It's called Twisted, and it changed my life. The initial reason I wrote that book is because I was visiting high schools, and I was getting the same question from teenage boys everywhere, which was, teenage boys would ask me, I liked your book, but they'd say, I was confused why she was so upset. And that question came from a wonderful place. It came from a really earnest, kind of innocent place, because so many of them were raised with the myth that it's always the bad guy in the bushes with a gun. And from their perspective, well, she has sex, but she was dancing with them, and it doesn't take that long. What's the big deal is what they were asking. And the first dozen times I heard that question, I wanted their mother's phone number, because I was going to call her up and tell her she was a terrible parent. But then I stopped being so judgy, and I realized that I didn't understand their perspective. So again, I had to shut up and listen. And so I started to interview teenage boys and adult men across the country to understand that perspective. And then, but those conversations were so interesting, I started to ask them, so I'm not a guy, I didn't have brothers or sons, so what's hard for guys? I know what's hard for girls. what's hard for teenage guys? And they were so generous. I mean, I just fell in love. I really like men and boys. I just fell in love with all of them all over again because they're awesome, right? And they told me, 3 things kept on coming up in every conversation. They said, girls are really confusing. Granted. I was stunned to find out how many of them had to deal with bullying. And I think this has everything to do with most educational institutions are not designed to nurture children. They're just designed to house children. And boys develop physically at such dramatically different rates in middle school. And then you have this toxic masculinity and this power differential. And bullying is a huge, much bigger problem than I ever realized. It's horrifying. Yeah, and then so many guys that I talked to were really sad because they didn't have an authentic relationship with either their biological father, even if he lived in their house, or any guy who could be kind of like a dad or uncle figure. So they're wandering the woods of adolescence, confused, right? Often looking over their shoulder, because teenagers are horrible to each other sometimes, and then just being lonely, when without anybody to explain to them the rules of the road, you know? It's like, what's this human integrity? So that's what the book that became Twisted. It wound up also looking at suicide, which I hadn't intended when I started writing it, but it just kind of came out of it organically. One of the things I read for the research for Twisted is this great work that was done by a female sociologist who was investigating testosterone. Because, you know, teenage boys, their testosterone level goes like from 0 to 800 when they're about 13, 14, and then it drops off, right? It's amazing that any teenage boy can walk around. That's just, whew, you guys. And so this woman, as part of her, why do you think they're always bending over water fountains, right? Very inconvenient boners. And so this female sociologist, under doctor's supervision, had a testosterone patch put on her arm so she could experience a heightened level of testosterone. Not as much as the average man, but maybe a man with lower testosterone. And then she explained how dramatically that changed her life. Like getting caught off in traffic made her like turn into the Hulk. She wanted to rip off car doors and take people's faces off. And then she went and in this paper I read talked about how that's one of the huge challenges for young teenage boys. And when I say young, you know, 14. Because all these body chemicals are like going haywire, girls have body chemicals going haywire too, but we in the adult community don't have great ways of talking about this and giving them opportunities to explain both the emotional stuff as well as the physical. So I came away from the project with a lot more respect for men. I mean, I had a lot to begin with, and you guys have heard the term toxic masculinity getting, you know, thrown about. And I hope none of you feel like that's an attack on masculinity, because masculinity is awesome. So is femininity. But it's that toxic, because I think we send this message in American culture that men are supposed to have a limited range of emotions, which is not healthy for anybody. Men are allowed to show anger, preferably in a sports field. And that's not, you know, and so there's a lot of really confused guys who are brought up with standards of what they think masculinity is that leads to a lot of broken hearts. That was a super long answer. Sorry, rambling. Anyone right there? Yeah.
What inspired you to write Wintergirls?
Oh, Wintergirls is a book that I wrote about eating disorders. Eating disorders is the worst. I would rather have a kid addicted to Coke or heroin than a kid caught in the throes of an eating disorder, because at least the culture will tell you don't do drugs. That's not smart. But when people get thin in America, everyone's like, oh my God, you look so great, right? And then it's like, gotta eat. I wrote it because, well, I have a friend who's a pediatrician, first of all. She works with teenagers, and she had been bugging me for years because she had patients who would come into her office with speak, because she's a really good doctor. And they would often speak up to her first because they had been the victim. And she said, we need a book like that for eating disorders. And I said, I'm not doing it. That's my own, like, I was raised by a strange mom. She had some strange ideas. But then one day I went to my mailbox. This is back when people wrote like real letters on paper. And there were 3 letters from 3 different eating disorder clinics across the country, all from teenage girls, inpatient girls, who had read Speak and wanted a story that reflected their experience. And like, my daddy was a preacher, right? So that's like the modern equivalent of a burning bush, is when you get 3 letters in the mail like that. It's like, all right, I get it. And it actually wound up being so healthy for me, because I had to like all the negative self-talk in that book is what I used to tell myself. So that wound up being kind of healthy. It's interesting, people who are on the conservative side of things in terms of their religion and politics tend to be the people who criticize me for writing Speak. Liberals like to ban books too. When Wintergirls came out, like there was this column in the New York Times, and like all these liberal New York City moms hopped onto it and called me really bad names because they thought that the book would entice their children into eating disorders. And first of all, I worked with a bunch of professionals, had them evaluate the book, and that was a concern for me. I don't want this book to trigger people. And they all said, billboards trigger people on the cusp of having an eating disorder. People magazine triggers people, right? You can't, that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to tell the truth about what these kids are feeling on the inside. But yeah, so the moms in the New York Times, the well column, so don't ever think that liberals don't want to ban books too, so they do. I have a girlfriend who went out to Berkeley, California. She's a picture book illustrator, right? And she went out, with Berkeley, California is a super, it's like the Republic of Berkeley, very liberal. And so she's in elementary school and she's doing her presentation and about her fun little books, and the principal, she gets called down to the principal office because there's a group of angry parents. And it was Halloween time, so she thought, oh no, because there's some people, conservative religious people, who are not fans of Halloween. And she's like, oh no, here we go. And she gets there, crunchy granola, Berkeley, California. No. The parents that were upset at her were Wiccans. They were all people who practiced witchcraft in their spare time, and that was sort of their faith-based, and very liberal people. They didn't like the way that the witch was portrayed in her book. It was promoting stereotypes. So, yeah, it's a strange, but we all have the right to create what we want to create in America. Any last minute questions? Going once, going twice. Give yourselves a hand. You guys were wonderful. Thank you very much.